Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, which is in association with the Agile Business Conference. The theme of today's presentation is a magic potion of scaling Agile, and I'm delighted to welcome our two presenters today, both from Tata Consultancy Services and with many, many years experience and knowledge of Agile. The two presenters are Manav James. Manav I've known for many years and had the pleasure of attending his presentations on a number of occasions. Manav's the head of Agile Consulting at TCS, and he's joined by his colleague today, James Gamble. James is a principal Agile coach at TCS and likewise has a lot of experience in very large Agile transformations. So we've got two people that really know their stuff, and I'm delighted to say at the end of the webinar there'll be opportunity for questions. So just to remind you, the webinar's in association with the Agile Business Conference, which is on the 6th and 7th of October in London. It's agileconference.org. I'll remind everybody at the end. But what I will do now, without further ado, is hand over to Manav and James. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Alex. I assume you can hear me.
Like his swimming class. Yeah.
Hey, you can hear us okay, Alex? I'm not sure if all the lines are muted, especially yours, if that is the one where we're getting a little bit of background noise. Okay, that is probably gone away. So, good afternoon, everyone. As Alex mentioned, I'm Manav, and the next voice you'll hear is from James. Hello. Great. Complexity and change happening in the way people adopt Agile today, or they transform into Agile ways of working. So we will pull in our experiences to share what we have seen in the industry and hopefully give you some helpful pointers. I have had multi-industry experience. I used to be head of project program management within Yahoo Europe for a long time. I worked with Microsoft, Vodafone, lots of large, complex organizations, helping them adopt Agile. We'll stop it there and let James introduce themselves.
Hello. Yes, my background's technical, so I started off as a developer, but in R&D and proof of concept systems, mainly for the military, and that meant that we didn't have requirements documents. It was very blue sky R&D, and therefore current development practices at the time weren't applicable to us. They didn't suit us. So we started sort of hand rolling our own processes in the sort of early mid 90s, and that's where my interest in sort of lightweight iterative development came from. And so as soon as we discovered Scrum and XP at the time, I was hooked on the Agile bandwagon, or I would have been if they'd actually invented the term then. But as soon as they'd invented the term, I was hooked on it. And I've been consulting on Agile as an Agile coach for about 8 years now, working with a number of the well-known banks and insurance companies, and financial services companies as well, both in Britain and in Europe. And so I'm afraid I consider myself fully bought into the Agile, fully drunk of the Agile Kool-Aid, I'm afraid. So that's where I'm coming from.
Great, thanks, James. So within military experience, it's clear to say no plan survive is the reality of the battlefield.
Contact with the enemy.
Yeah, great. Okay, so what we're going to cover today is broadly in these 6 categories. We'll share a little bit about the market trends which we see, and really why do we need to change? Because that's certainly one of the key things which comes up. Why change something which is not broken? We'll share a little bit about the Agile adoption patterns and the key challenges which we find associated to them. We'll also talk a little bit about, of course, the scaled Agile methods, frameworks which are out there, and where is their time and space in the grand scheme of things. And then we'll focus in on the culture and environment aspects, because as you would have seen in the outline, that is certainly one of the key organizational change elements which we consider. And then start to funnel in on what we think is that magic potion in the context of this discussion. So very quickly, moving on to the market trends then. So within TCS, we commissioned a lot of studies, and then some of the latest CIO trends, I looked up on them. So what you see on the screen here now, things like globalization, simplification, focusing on the digital aspects, sort of Internet of Things, and of course business buyer being the ultimate influencer, and the business transformation paradigm are the broad headings in which we say we see the CIO trends emerging. Now, if we look at a little bit deeper into this and the organizations we are supporting today on an Agile transformation journey, a lot of these are the drivers for those organizations as well. Now, if I just take one or two examples here, like simplification, that's the interesting one where you're looking at the current business processes and see how many of those process steps do you really need. If you are tendering a check in the bank, which very few of us do nowadays, let's face it, but then how many steps are there for the check tendering process? Do there really need to be those many business process steps? I know a lot of large banking and financial institutions are considering scanning a check, for example. So simplification of the business processes so that you do not have to look at all of the complex business landscape as it stands today. Another one I'll just quickly pick on is the digital world. Now, working with lots of large complex organizations, digital a few years ago was a channel. It was one of the go-to-market ways of working. Now, we see today it is the way of doing things. And as in the past, people were developing for multiple channels, whether that's a point of sale, whether it's retail and digital. Nowadays, what people are trying to do, or the organizations, they're embedding digital at the heart of what they do, and that is sort of the channel from which things evolve. Very quickly, also then sharing some insights into why we think Agile is as popular and as much needed as a business paradigm and not just as a development practice. Because again, on the screen you see there's several of the drivers which are there from a CIO perspective. And even before you start an Agile discussion, you could just put this slide up, and this should be the way software delivery, systems development should be operating anyways. So blurring of lines between business and technology, moving from systems of record to systems of engagement. It's a very interesting one where you see a lot of investment being driven by innovation, or what we call the systems of engagement, where the user experience at the hands of the ultimate customer becomes of paramount importance. Now, again, what does it imply? People are looking at shorter feedback cycles, looking at Agile as a delivery method. Again, picking just a few, multi-speed delivery. This is another very interesting phenomenon or ways of working which we see with large organizations, where part of the organization is still working in longer release cycles, less collaborative ways of working, whereas the innovation-centric, the parts of the organization which want to push things out to production quicker, help realize the business value as soon as possible, they are working at almost at a very phenomenally high speed. Now, how do you reconcile those when they sit within the same organizational landscape? Now, equally, to the far right, there is very clear call to action with some of these things. There are at least 4 categories in which we see. There has to be that mindset, a cultural shift of the organization from things like we focus on the cost to actually delivering value. We are clearly seeing that service-oriented models, pay-per-use as the key drivers. On the process side, of course, as Agile Devops, automation is the key, but also interestingly around skills, that some of the subtleties around Agile ways of working is around upskilling people, working more collaboratively, underpinned by a tool set which is there to support faster deliveries, and it's also there to scale. Now, very swiftly moving on to some of the Agile adoption patterns, and I'll look up to James to cover this well.
Okay, so certainly when I started, and it's still the same now, I think, in a lot of organizations, but when organizations initially adopt Agile, they adopt it at a small scale. It might be an individual project or a set of related projects or a set of teams will adopt Agile, and it'll be a small part of the organization. To allow to enable these projects to work differently from the rest of the wider organization, we develop interface between the area that's now working in an agile manner and the area that's left as is. And so in this adapter layer, we looked at how do we plug in the needs of the agile projects to the organization. Standard way that the organizations always work. There isn't a massive driver to change the rest of the organization because the agile is only a small part of that wider organization. So we've talked about things staying what is. Well, what are those sorts of things? This is a non-exhaustive list, but things that will stay the same will be things like the organizational structure will just tends to stay as normal. Management process and tooling, you might already have tooling that managers are using to keep track of time, of budget, and typically organizations try to keep using these because they've all focused in on a particular system and everyone needs to use it. So we have to figure out how do the agile projects use the existing systems. With governance, the governance stakeholders, they'll be expecting particular work products at certain times. In an agile project, maybe you don't produce those work products, and maybe you produce them at different times. So there's education around that you'd have to think about. Funding typically stays the same, so it's maybe an annual funding cycle. Even for agile projects where we're trying to be more flexible. Marketing possibly stays the same. Physical environment, if you're only changing a small part of the business, then they tend to leave people where they are, and so you're sat in your normal environment but working differently. And also the technical environment. One of the big areas that often is a bit of a challenge initially in adoption is around test environment, where on an agile project we're wanting test environments pretty much from day one. Well, in the teams that supply and maintain the technical environments may not work in that way or haven't worked in that way before. And right down to things like human resources, about what the job descriptions, what are people willing to do, what are they not willing to do, how is training done, what's on the training curriculum that people can actually do. So there's lots of the organisation that will stay in the old way whilst you're trying to adopt Agile on a small scale. On the Agile adoption, the version 1, the tool company, every year at the moment is doing a state of Agile survey. And quite frankly, I can't remember how we used to do Agile presentations before we had all this material to rip off. But it's really interesting, and they produce one of these every year, and this is from the latest one that's published, the 9th one. And what this shows is there's a number of different methods that people are using for Agile, but by far the most popular currently is Scrum. And I think part of the reason for this is, obviously this is a survey, people are filling in a form and sending in the results. And certainly what I find is, as I go around and talk with organizations, a lot of people equate Agile and Scrum as pretty much the same thing. So people say they're doing Scrum almost no matter what sort of Agile they're doing, because Agile is Scrum. But it does show that Scrum is tremendously popular, and that's definitely what we find on the ground as we go around. So as a quick overview, so that means what are people generally doing on their Agile projects? From the Scrum Alliance, we've stolen this diagram, and very quickly, if people aren't aware of Scrum, is we build up a backlog of end-to-end slices of functionality that describe the product that we want to produce, or we believe we want to produce. And we put this into an ordered backlog, so it's prioritized, so the highest prioritized items are at the top. As a team, we go into our sprint planning, and we're going to deliver our solution in a series of short sprints, of short time boxes. And in planning, we look at what's in the product backlog and think, what can we fit into the next sprint? And on here, you can see a sprint is giving us 2 to 4 weeks. There's always a pressure on trying to reduce that down, so 2 and 3 weeks is probably the most common length. So what can we do as a team in the next 2 to 3 weeks? And we produce a sprint backlog, what we're going to commit to trying to do in those 2 to 3 weeks. We then start our sprint, and every day during the sprint we have a daily Scrum where the team gets together as a coordination meeting. And people say what they're up to, what they're planning on doing, and very importantly, anything that's impeding them, that's blocking their progress. And at the end of our sprint, we have what's called a potentially shippable product increment. So something that we could ship, it's good enough quality to ship. Obviously, after the first sprint, you may not have enough to actually a functionality that you want to release to a customer. But the functionality you do have is of a complete suitable quality that it could go out as releasable quality. And then after you have a demo with your customer stakeholders, customer group, you get feedback, you have a retrospective from the team to understand how you can work better, and you go back around to sprint planning, looking at your backlog again. So you have this regular cycle, and this is what for a team. Now when we scale that up and people start to say, well, we want to do sort of more of this, Scrum has the idea of a scrum of scrums. So we can have related teams, and they will have their daily scrums, but then possibly once or twice a week we have a scrum of scrums where a representative from each of the teams comes together and we coordinate across that set of teams. And then potentially you can have a scrum of scrums if you've got a wider set of related teams. And in this way we can start to tackle quite large pieces of work, quite large problems in this way. The problem comes as we get bigger and bigger, that it can become a bit of a soup of work. It can get very complex very quickly. In large organizations where, in a bank where a single transaction can cross many, many boundaries and involve many, many teams, very quickly we start to get very complex systems. This idea of just doing more of the same starts to break down. We just can't do more Scrum. We start to have problems. And so as we look at Agile, this is a case where size really does matter. The fact that as we get bigger, we start to introduce different problems, and we have to start looking at things in a different way.
Right. So what are the sort of documented problems then? Because we've just seen Scrum, which is the almost like de facto Agile implementation. Now, interestingly, I have my own reasons why that is the case. But then there's a scaling aspect to Scrum, which could be in the form of Scrum or Scrums. But then also from the same survey from version 1, what they said is, what are the reasons why people adopt Agile? And some of these themes haven't changed as much. So, of course, acceleration of product delivery, managing changing priorities, and the one which has recently moved up the list is increased productivity. That's great, but if you look at towards the bottom of this list as well, it's quite interesting to see that it's not the reasons like improved engineering discipline, team morale, or better management of distributed team is less important. It is not the driver by default for an Agile adoption. That's not to say there are not good examples of people doing it, but then if they were to, let's say, improve engineering discipline, it seems like it's not the first thing that they will look at. Okay, well, how does Agile help us do that? And also in the same survey, it's quite nicely put together around why Agile adoptions fail. Now, again, they've been doing the survey year in year, and some of the themes haven't changed as much. It's important to reflect that the note at the bottom that most of these, or at least the top few, are related to the organizational culture and general resistance to change. Now, when we work with large, complex organizations on a regular basis, we do what we call it the frozen middle, or also how do you replicate this across the organization, and how do you create this as a culture in which you are no more just doing Scrum or doing Agile methods, but you embody those value sets, and the culture itself is as such that it just comes naturally to you. How else would you do that? Those are the kind of questions which are cited as the reasons for challenges around Agile adoption. Now, it's also important to understand then that which means we have probably done some of the local optimum. We have moved on from what used to be a single team issue to something which is of a scale issue. And with any method and its maturity, we do find that to be the case, where after a certain point, you start to uncover new problems or new challenges, as with the theory of constraints. So we've moved on from what used to be a method and a team-level constraint onto what is more of an organizational constraint. And that's where a lot of people are looking up to what we call as a scaled Agile methods or suite of methods out there. Now, before we spend a little bit of time discussing some of these methods, I do want to say a disclaimer straight away. This is not a session where we are deep diving into any one particular method. In the next few minutes, I'll give you a quick whistle-stop tour of what all methods are out there, or at least the most popular ones. Because what we find working with organizations, quite often, they are only aware of one or two of them, and almost they just think of them as the way forward. So the first one on the list, and in no particular order, if you are aware of Scrum.org, it's the organization who also has a parallel certification structure to Scrum Alliance. If you have done the Professional Scrum Master certifications or are aware of that, that is run by Scrum.org. So they have actually come up with this particular model where how you could take your Scrum and then build on top of that. So if you see the red arrows are the red dots along these are the enterprise level adoption or an enterprise level sort of items. If you look at then the gray ones, they are the business unit ones, and then the hollow red circle is the team level. So for example, in the bottom part, you'll say the team level processes, they could stay, and it's very nicely is the Scrum image. So you could be doing a team level Scrum, that's absolutely okay. But then how does that align to the strategic vision, which is more at the enterprise and business unit level? But you can see the way arrows are flowing, that sort of filters down to what a team is actually doing by the way of backlog prioritization and backlog decomposition of and refinements. Now, this model, it's not as old, but then it is one where you can see natural progression from a scale of Scrum of Scrums to what we call as a scaling of Scrum. Now, of course, with the words as well, because Scrum is the most popular method, a lot of people are looking up to this particular method. The next one on the list here, as you can see, is something called Disciplined Agile Delivery, which has been promoted quite heavily by Scott Ambler. And he, again, built on the foundation of RUP. What this is, as you can see at the bottom, it talks about various stages of inception, construction, transition. And on the top, you can still see an iteration of work, or you can call it your sprint. Well, what happens before that and what happens after that, it tries to put that landscape together for you. And you start with sort of envisioning, and you start with your sort of Uber product backlog, and then you will do some iteration planning, do the iteration, and then towards further right, get it all the way to production. So this is your second scaled framework which you could use. And again, you can look up more details for each of these if you like. The next one on the list is DSDM, Dynamic Systems Development Method. Again, it has gone through various iterations, and especially in UK, it's quite a popular method because it's been a British standard for a while. It also talks around how you could use some of the early planning phases around pre-project phases to do some feasibility and understand a bit of foundational work before you get into your development cycles towards the left. And then what else do you need to do from implementation and post-production point of view? And this is one of the latest versions where Scrum is again quite integral and well integrated into the framework. And interestingly, Agile Business Conference is also one which is a DSCM consortium event. So DSCM is certainly quite heavy on the agenda there. The next one I'd like to share with you is some promoted by Craig Larman and Yeah, okay, that's right. It's Craig and his team. Let's put it that way. Some of those guys are coming to Agile Business Conference as well. Interestingly, this is less as it's large-scale Scrum, and again, some of the organizations we've worked with are using that. You can see it's quite a nice representation of the way they've depicted the ecosystem around the bit in the middle, which is still around Scrum and sprint language, if you like. You're doing sprint planning, what you looked at previous ones, retrospectives, and looking ahead for the next one. That's all great. But what helps outside of this is you look at the bottom, the sort of top left there, lean thinking and principles, systems thinking. You form communities to enable this to happen. You have then communities around product owners, requirement areas. There's a regular coaching, continuous improvement. So again, a bit of a holistic view of what organizational ecosystem you need to develop. So again, this is one other option for you. And if anyone's looked at scaling Scrum, even if they put that in a search engine and you haven't found this as one of your top search results, then I'm not too sure the search engine optimization is working well. Exactly, change your search engine. And this is Dean Lippingwell and the team, which they call it a Scaled Agile Framework. Again, there are lots of certifications, lots of training available around this method as well. And very nicely, it looks at the three organizational constructs around the portfolio level, the program, and the team level. And if you see at the team level, you still have those backlogs around Scrum. You still have Scrum lingo, like on the left-hand side you see product owner, Scrum Master, and so on and so forth. What it then starts to add is concepts like Agile release trains, where people, well, all these teams come together and they look at planning across the teams and not just with them, and then it's all driven by business priority and lean thinking at the top. Now, I mean, all of these frameworks have a time and space for what they do. I have spent a bit of time looking at SAFe as well. It's fine. I mean, they've got all good things to themselves. It's not a bad one. But what you see is that if you're just doing things at scale, you find still you have impacted more of the organization, but you still have elements of the organization which are left as is. Now, with this thinking, as more of the organization is doing Agile, you start to see more revenue coming from Agile ways of working or Agile projects, if you like, but there is still that stickiness in the organization missing where, well, the de facto way of doing things is Agile. Now, from our experience, we've clearly seen that there is increasingly mismatch between how an organization is run in general and how the revenues are obtained. And of course, it doesn't then go to the heart of fixing the issue around the delivery and also working for the business and the technology functions to work together and, as we say, joined to the hip.
Okay, so, I'm in trouble driving this thing. It's only got 2 buttons and I hit the wrong one. So we now have this, we run the danger of having this disconnect between how the wider organization is run and how its products develop. And at best, this causes a lot of frustration on both sides of the argument. But at worst, it means that an organization is not really getting the benefit of Agile. It's missing the benefit of Agile because these wider things, especially around marketing and funding, and things are done in a sort of traditional manner. So they're not really getting all the benefits they could from Agile. And part of this is around the culture. Especially around sort of product ownership and Agile in general, and how Spotify are working. And this quote about culture eats process for breakfast is the argument that it doesn't really matter what process you want to introduce to your organization or you think your organization should follow. What it will follow is what the culture dictates that it will follow. So whatever process you add to an organization, it'll get mutated to match the culture. So Spotify has been very open about its experiments in Agile, and it started as I understand it started as a Scrum development organization, but its culture allows it to flex and change, and so it's running pretty much experiments in Agile, and it's coming up with some very interesting results, which a number of organizations that we talk to mention and are interested in. And what they're doing is they're sort of evolving an approach that matches their culture and developing a culture to match their approach. So they're doing this sort of double-handed thing, which is really, really interesting and powerful. And why we think this is powerful is that if we look at plants need the right environment to grow. You need to put them into the right soil to grow, and they need to have the right weather as well. So the soil type, thinking of the farming analogy, dictates actually what you can plant. You can't plant anything in any type of soil. it won't grow, and you can't plant anything anywhere on the planet. Again, it won't grow. So you've got to think about what environment have we got to what we can plant and successfully grow. And this is sort of the arguments around people from the Champagne region saying only the wine grown in their area can be called Champagne. It's because it's the only wine grown in that environment, in that soil, with that weather, with those techniques, that can be called Champagne. And so for organizations, for organizations that want to adopt Agile, it doesn't matter how much you want to adopt Agile. If your organizational environment isn't welcoming for this, it won't work. You can't grow Agile in an organization that has the wrong culture. So there's a model called the Schneider Model, which is very interesting, and these hand-drawn diagrams come from Michael Sahota from some of his work, some of his presentations, if you want to look them up. And the Schneider Model looks at organizations across a number of axes, or cultural number of axes. So you can have organizations that are more control-orientated in the top right hand, or more collaborative or more competence-based, so it's a sort of meritocracy type idea, or it's one that's very that cultivates people and products. If we grow our people, then they will grow the organization. And what Michael Sahota did was he mapped the Agile Principles, because if you know the Manifesto Principles, so the frameworks that Manav talked about earlier, they're Agile frameworks, not because of the activities that are contained within them, but because they align to the values and principles of the Agile Manifesto and the Agile principles behind them. So what Michael Sahota did was he took these principles, summarized them a bit, but he mapped them against these axes. And what you can see here is that most of them land in the collaboration, cultivation space with some incompetence. Now, the competence part of the Agile is actually, I think, much stronger than the principles suggest. So I think there's much more work going on in the competence area than this shows. But fundamentally, we're in this collaboration cultivation area. And there's one quadrant that's remarkably empty. And if we're thinking of large organizations, you would sort of imagine that a lot of large organizations have a culture that's in this top right-hand quadrant, more of a control-based culture. So this suggests that if you are an organization with a control-based culture, it's not an ideal environment for Agile to take and to grow.
So what is the magic potion then? As we start to sort of descend towards our closing time, let me just share with you what we think working with all these large complex organizations we find. So clearly, I think it's important that you have to cultivate this suitable organizational environment for Agile to flourish. As James was saying, think of your organization where you are growing plants or you're nurturing talent. And that is the way you start to change that thinking. It's also important to really look at Agile as a culture rather than processes, because processes you comply or do for the sake of it, whereas culture is the way you do things. If you go into an organization, as we go into several of these, they're quite often like, well, how do you do this? And that culture really drives everything within an organization. So if you're looking at how the incentive structure works, well, if you know that that is fostering collaboration, then you incentivize teams rather than individuals to do the right kind of thing. And that's where the culture element becomes important. And as the same work which Michael Sahota did is also very clearly explaining, are you adopting Agile as in the left side it suggests, or are you transforming to an Agile culture? If you're adopting Agile, you're just doing it at the process level. You need to be very careful with that. But if you're taking a change-centric approach where you understand that this will have to be a longer journey, it will have to look at various organizational component parts to come together, and you would need a visionary leader to make this change happen, you're looking at a transformation. And quite often, the most common and quite a valuable framework to look at the organization change is the quarters model. And again, I won't go into the detail here, but ultimately, it's about creating the sense of urgency, building guiding coalition, and so on it goes all the way until such time we institute the change. So in the interest of the time, I would certainly just give you a whistle-stop tour of this, and you are more than free to look up and find more about the quarters model. You can look at many fancy change frameworks, but if you look at something as simple as that, because we want to focus on the change itself and not the framework or process of change. So ultimately, if we only value technical ads, we should not only value technical aspects, but also the cultural aspects. And to do that, we actually need organizational slices.
Yeah, so if we're looking at introducing Agile transformation, we want to introduce not only the practices, the Agile practices, but also we need the culture that surrounds that to enable those to work. And so one way of doing this is to think about having end-to-end organizational slices. In Agile, we talk about end-to-end feature slices and backlogs because we want to be able to deliver executable slices of the system that we can test. Well, we want to do that at a bigger scale. Work, how is the board working in an agile manner? How does governance, funding, marketing, all these sorts of things work for the bits of the organization that we're transforming? So this allows the culture to grow as we go. We can test the culture, we can flex it, we can evolve it as we go, so we can take the learnings from one slice into the next. Mr. Fuller has a great quote about you can't change things by fighting existing reality. You've got to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So it's very hard to do these changes slice by slice. So another way of looking at this may be to say, if we have an organization, could we identify a part of it, a small part of that, to be the company we wanted to be? Could we create our new company in the small and create a mini version? So this is, if you like, one step aside to the standard company. So here you can imagine taking over the floor of a building and making it into an area where you've got space for your stand-ups to happen, for co-location. We've got the right tools in place. We've got the infrastructure in place. People aren't being judged at their individual level, but maybe at the team level to get the teamwork going. So looking at governance and sort of appraisal and training, job descriptions that may change. So we create a mini company. And then as we get this working, we take more of the existing company over into this new organization. So we don't try and transform the old organization as much as grow a new organization with the culture that we would like to see. And hopefully you end up with a new organization.
Great. So I think let's just try and summarize what we've just learned. Clearly, and also I think I would like to give you a tool so that at least you can start to get onto this journey with your organizations. So what we tend to do is when we go into an organization, we start to look at mapping some of the organizational culture using these organizational attributes onto what we think are Agile values. So when people say we want to transform into Agile ways of working, brilliant. Okay, so how are we doing for people and talent and collaboration side? How do we have that culture where people can then work together and they're actually forced to work together in some sense? Now, if we look at, for example, product quality is one of the key Agile attributes, and do we have some business tools to help support that? I mean, there's lots of talk around Devops nowadays, but is that just a tooling perspective, or is that actually getting people to collaborate? It is also, from our point of view, very much around having that Agile culture embedded all the way through to be able to then deliver as fast as we can. So again, you're very welcome to take this away and use in your organizations to create an initial landscape, and then you can look at how you improve that going forward. Now, for me, there are sort of key takeaways, 3 of them at least, from this discussion. That scaling frameworks are useful templates, but they're not silver bullets. Now, if you think that is the next big thing, and any one of those frameworks which we discussed earlier, let's say that, or any of the other ones, will just help solve your problems, that's not going to be the case. They're helpful, as George Box says, all models are wrong, but some are helpful. And with Jürgen, he's taken a bit further. All models are useful, but some fail faster than the others. So the sentiment of Agile still is about fail fast and learn from it so that we don't repeat those mistakes and we've eliminated one potential option. And of course, the organizations see the greatest benefits from Agile when they have the supporting environment and cultivate the Agile culture. As we discussed all through, that planting the seed in the right environment is more important than just the seed itself. And of course, to transform using end-to-end organizational slices, as James just explained, so that the organization matures as the environment is also evolving, ultimately leading to successful Agile at scale. James, do you want to add anything to the takeaways here?
No.
So, in the interest of the time, I think that's where we are with it, and I shall move on to the Q&A session then. So if you've got any questions, please put them in your chat window, and we shall then start to take those questions. Oh, actually, the question list has been building up, and it's quite a long list. We just realized that that is where we need to see the questions. If I can see a way to make it slightly bigger. So how do you reconcile Agile and RAD method with distributed teams and offshoring?
Manav looking at me on that one. I got the short straw on that one. Well, obviously that ideally, for Agile, it's best to have co-located teams. You know, it's a design activity. We need to be able to bounce ideas. We want that quick responsiveness. We want the feedback. And so, and this is part of the cultural change that many times splitting work certainly across geographic boundaries, but even between offices, seems sensible in a sort of traditional model. It doesn't necessarily make sense in an Agile model. So this is part of the cultural change and understanding that I think needs to be looked at. Sometimes you're distributed because you're actually trying to get scarce skills. So it doesn't. So you can't get the people onshore. But for me, I would always try and co-locate. If you then can't co-locate, it's saying, well, how few locations can we co-locate the people at those locations? If we're going to have distributed work, can we distribute feature teams, not split teams? But if we're still in that dispersed world, then you need support of tooling. Plus, you might also have, it's always a hard one to get, but travel costs. You know, still have face-to-face time. And one of the companies I'm working with, they've just had someone who's come back from Singapore who's spent 3 weeks in Singapore, working with the team in Singapore, and now come back to London. So that you get that face-to-face and just meet people, see them, get to know them better. It makes everything else move along better. But I don't think there's a simple answer. Ideally, don't do it, and it's an education thing for management.
Well, one of the things, I'll just build upon that. A lot of organizations we work with, of course, have distributed ways of working. And one of our key customers one day said to me, you know what, if I can't shout across at the top of my voice to the person, then we are distributed. So I think it's important to understand what is distribution, and there's a whole raft of topics around distribution, and there are ways you can work better, but equally the lesser the collocation, so the lesser the distribution, I think the better it is overall. But then at the very least, look at how soon can there be some face-to-face meetings, and then also when it is not possible, then how can you collocate? I give quite often the example of your families. How would you interact with your families? Quite often you'll do WhatsApp or ring them, but you would like to do every so often video conference, maybe every weekend, who are spread at different locations. Some people do FaceTime every day. And of course, there is no substitute to meeting up with that. So have a family bond with people, I would say. There's another very interesting question come up where someone's asked, what portion of your clients should start with the cultural elements of Agile versus trying to consider it once they are not getting the benefits? I think it's a very pertinent question, and one which is, I think, at the heart of lots of conversations nowadays. It's easier to straight away start with a method, and for me, the answer to that is, if you look up in your organizations as well, if you see, is someone doing a daily stand-up? Is there a visual information radiator somewhere, which quite often people confuse with the Kanban? Is there some sort of a backlog-driven approach taking home? Is there some sort of continuous integration, test-driven development happening? So you would find that practices are more easily adopted, and you will find pockets of excellence in that. But then organizational culture is unfortunately something which people don't always start with. And let's face it, some organizations are better at aligning their culture to an agile way of working than some of the other organizations who are maybe still very much around incentivizing heroes for putting off fires rather than sort of making sure teams who don't put up fires anyway, they should be rewarded. So unfortunately, not as many, but then we are seeing a growing trend as people have seen method alone will not get to the benefits they want it to be. They are now looking up to culture as a change. And you only need to look up at last Agile Business Conference, where there were so many influences to Agile culture and also lots of sessions in that area. James, do you want to pick up the next question?
The team that are looking after those systems aren't working in an agile manner. Then and it's very hard for the other teams in that process to approach. Something like that is the governance, multiple ways of doing funding, multiple ways of doing marketing. So people are working in different modes, and I think it can get quite confusing. You tend to end up with blends of governance and marketing that aren't one or the other, and so you're not really getting the benefit from either way of doing it. So I think that can be quite tricky. But fundamentally, I think whether a company should go 100% agile is what the customer expectations are as well. You need to look at what the market is. If you're in a market that currently you don't need to do, there isn't a great demand for change, so it's quite static. You'll get benefit from doing agile, I would argue, in a better product anyway, better quality, etc. Being able to control and drive that product more. But with those sorts of timescales, does the whole organisation have to be agile? If you're in an industry where people are expecting changes quite rapidly, then I would suggest that there's more drive to go 100% agile. The other thing that I have in mind is, today is the slowest the world will ever be again. This is the slowest it'll ever be. So the world is only going to speed up. Businesses are only going to have to speed up. Change is only going to come along quicker. So I think even sort of traditional legacy systems, I think there's going to be more and more pressure on getting legacy systems to be more agile as well.
The only thing I'll add to that is that I think, again, we have very many different views on what agile is for people, and as we touched upon in this webinar as well, that a lot of people just equate that to Scrum, which is a mechanical way of approaching agile. So in a single sentence, if I was to say, yes, organizations should become 100% agile, but actually that is embodying those value sets and principles around collaboration, openness, honesty, quicker time to market, and also focusing more on the ultimate customer value delivery. So those fundamental tenets of agile should be followed. Whether you use SAFe, DAD, Scrum, I think that is less important, because you'll find these are more relevant to certain parts of your organization, and yes, so you might find that. Just very quickly, picking up another question where we hear a lot about DevOps. How can Agile and DevOps be used in the same environment? Are there any synergies? So one of my very good friends is actually writing a book on Lean DevOps, which I was interacting with him earlier this week. Now, and he said there is no commonality of purpose and definition when it comes to DevOps. If you actually look at SEI Institute's definition, I think off the top of my head, it goes something like it is where the developments and operations work synchronously, and there are no major barriers between them. And that's its interesting essence, where ultimately this is about you being able to take a system of software all the way up to production, and you're working together as one team to go towards it, which sometimes can go against the grain of what ITIL and some service frameworks have been proposing around harder gated approaches. So ultimately, TCS's take on DevOps is more around that there needs to be an underpinning agile culture. There needs to be collaboration, not just between people, also with platforms, and you need to have certain tooling in place to be able to do the DevOps as it should be from a systems standpoint. Now, you still need your automated tests to be there. You still need your continuous integration and continuous sort of delivery and deployment to be in place to be able to do that DevOps. So, interestingly, for me, Agile is an enabler for DevOps, and DevOps is an enabler for Agile, because some of the DevOps-related practices which are being proposed today come from XP camp anyway, which has been one of the long-standing engineering processes within the Agile umbrella. So for me, that's not that different. James, anything from your side?
Nothing for me. Looking at the time.
So looking at time, we're starting to lose people, but I think the other questions we have covered one way or the other in our discussion. I'm just looking down the list. Is there anything in particular which we haven't touched upon? I think there is just one question around the testing side of things. How can you do 2 to 4 week sprint deliverables with a need for regression testing in mission critical applications? So again, Scrum suggests there to be 2 to 4 weeks of sprints, and of course it suggests that you have a potentially shippable product at the end of each increment. Now, as much as possible, the regression needs to be built into that. And the only way I have found this working in organizations is they have mature regression test packs, which you can run fairly quickly. If that's not the case and you are having to run manual regression, then it will take longer. There is no substitute for automated testing. And for Agile to work in a quick and fast and having those quicker turnaround times, there is really no way other than having automated testing.
Yeah, I think you've got to have automated testing. As Manav said, the 2 to 4 week is a guide, and certainly with my background, I've used sort of unified process type processes, and in those the time boxes could be longer. But the longer time boxes, you get less feedback. But if you can also do your regression testing, I would argue it's better feedback. And once you know how to deliver successfully, you can then figure out how to deliver successfully quicker. But a big thing of this, and I certainly find it quite a lot talking to organisations, to projects, is how much you're trying to put into a sprint. And if you're trying to do a 4 week sprint, it's better to do less in that time, but with the regression testing, than too much so you can't fit the regression testing in.
Just in Agile mode, sometimes it still carries the traditional method and ends up overriding the Agile method for budget, time, and resource issues. What do you suggest to have a control and as early warning? Well, I was a bit surprised we didn't have the traditional word come into this. So I think, look, if you are mixing the methods, then yes, there are hybrids you could try and take, but you are really compromising the agility for a start. So that is the biggest early warning. I'll raise my red flag now to say, actually, then the risk you run is you'll not have best of both, but you'll actually compromise on both. Plan-driven methods are not bad, but clearly there is a time and space for that. If all the requirements are fully understood, if you expect no changes whatsoever in the plan, and it's a repeatable way of working, which you've done it for several times, go ahead and use a plan-driven way of doing things, because it's a cookie-cutter thing you're doing. But if you're developing a new system, if you have complex changing requirements, if your ecosystem is evolving, there's a risk around what you would take into production, well, iterative and incremental Agile methods have proven to be of help. Now, if you're mixing the methods together, do that in a way where you understand what you're doing, what the risks are. But if your agility is getting compromised by a more plan-driven approach, then I wouldn't even call it much of an Agile thinking. You might be just cherry-picking 1 or 2 methods or practices, and that's really it. So that I would not term it as Agile. You may be better off taking a plan-driven route. At least you only have then a plan to be blamed and not the method. Because lots of time we hear people, Agile didn't work for us, and what it turns out is Agile helped people fail quicker, or it highlighted its systemic issues which were there anyways, and the problem is then people don't have a way to deal with it. So I think on that note, we'll certainly draw the webinar to a close. Hope this has been helpful to you, and we will be there in the Agile Business Conference as well, which is on 6th and 7th of October. If you happen to be around there, we're doing a headline act with Aviva presenting the case study as well. We will have a stand. We look forward to meeting you in person, but if not, you can certainly look us up on LinkedIn, and if you have questions, we can also take it up that way. So I don't know, Alec, if there's any closing remarks from Unicom? Anything you'd like to add, Alec? I think we've only seen the open line from Alec. I don't think there's anything we can hear from you, Alec. Okay. So I will just add my closing remarks in that case. So thanks very much for attending. And Alec was there. He'll just say thanks.
Hi, Manav. Can you hear me now? Apologies. There seemed to be a problem with the microphone.
Okay. No, we can hear you now.
Oh, that's very well. Just wanted to say thank you to you both for presenting it, and hopefully see some of you at the Agile Business Conference, as Manav mentioned, on the 6th and 7th of October. It's agileconference.org, the website. And also just to let you know that the recording will be available of this webinar. We'll send a link in the next few days so that you can share it with your colleagues and listen to the presentation again. So again, thank you everybody for joining.